The island of Cuba is currently facing the worst existential crisis that it has ever faced in its history. You've maybe missed what's going on here with all of the other chaotic things going on in the news right now, but over the past 5 years, Cuba has witnessed the most rapid population collapse that any society has experienced so far in the 21st century. At the start of the decade in 2020, Cuba was reported to have had a population of around 11.2 million people. Since then, it's been estimated by independent observers that as many as 2.75 million Cubans have left the island, meaning that nearly 1 in every 4 Cubans have probably left the country in only 5 years. An utterly catastrophic emptying out of the island's people. The Cuban government itself officially claims a much lower number of people who have left since 2020, but even their own likely downplayed data claims that 14% of the island's population have left the country over these past 5 years. Even if that official data was true, it would already be the second fastest rate of population decline experienced by any country in the world this decade, only behind the rate experienced in Ukraine. A country that has been actively at war for years and being massively invaded by its neighbor. If the official data is already that bad, the truth is probably much worse and closer to the independent analyses that are being done. The Cuban government now officially claims that the population on the island has shrunk from 11.2 million people in 2020 to around 9.7 million people as of the start of 2026. While the independent analysis conducted by Juan Carlos Alzibu Campos, a leading Cuban demographer, estimates that it's actually probably declined closer to around 8.25 million people instead. One of the biggest things that all of these people have been fleeing from has been a similarly rapidly collapsing economy. Since 2018, the Cuban economy has declined by at least 15%, and that's according to official Cuban government data. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began, inflation in the country has absolutely skyrocketed. In 2019, the Cuban peso traded at a value of 20 to 1 to the US dollar, but by November of 2025, it was trading at 450 to 1 to the US dollar at the informal rate instead, implying an annualized inflation rate of around 68% every year for 6 straight years, which has been verging on hyperinflation and wrecking Cuban savings. The Cuban Observatory for Human Rights, an NGO based abroad in Spain, has recently estimated that an astonishing 89% of the Cuban population now lives in extreme poverty, while 7 out of 10 Cubans are having to skip at least 1 meal per day. Only 3% are capable of finding the medicine that they require at pharmacies, 12% of the working-age population is presently unemployed, while a whopping 78% of Cubans they surveyed reported that they either wanted to leave the country themselves or knew someone else who did. Wages and the cost of living in Cuba have gotten to a point where life on the island is almost impossible for the vast majority of people. The official average monthly wage in Cuba, based on the government's own data, is just 6,506 pesos a month, which is about the same as just a little over $14 a month at the informal rate. And yet, a carton of 30 eggs on the island currently costs 2,800 pesos, equivalent to 43% of the average monthly wage. Even a kilo of rice and a kilo of beans, the typical staple diet in Cuba, currently costs the average worker in the country about 3 full days' worth of their labor. Gasoline shortages across the island have become chronic and too expensive for most to afford as well. Drivers frequently have to wait weeks now just in order to acquire a rationed allocation of 40 liters or 10.5 gallons of gas that now costs about $46, which is usually several times their own typical monthly wage. The highways across the country have emptied out. People in the rural countryside beyond the big cities have gone back to using horse-drawn carriages and carts because of the lack of fuel, while public transportation, even within the big cities, has effectively grinded to a halt. There is also an increasingly chronic electricity and energy shortage that has been suffocating the island as well. Mass blackouts have become routine occurrences since 2020, with no fewer than 5 nationwide blackouts taking place just across 2025. During the blistering heat of the summer, electricity across most of the island will flicker off for at least 4 hours a day now, while some of the lesser populated provinces outside of the major cities can sometimes go up to 20 hours a day without power, affecting everything from air conditioning to fans to refrigerators. Cuba is currently producing about 25% less power than it did just 6 years ago back in 2019, based on research published by Ricardo Torres, a Cuban economist affiliated with the American University, which is why the blackouts sweeping across the island have been increasing in frequency. The big reason why is because the vast majority of Cuba's electricity is generated by oil, with outdated and worn-out Soviet-era diesel generators, while the island's imports of oil have been dwindling and dwindling. Roughly 83% of Cuba's electricity is generated through burning oil at these diesel plants, while 60% of Cuba's oil demand has to be imported from abroad. Historically, until very recently, Venezuela was providing Cuba with the lion's share of its imported oil supply that it needed to keep the lights on. In 2021, Venezuela was providing Cuba with more than 100,000 barrels of oil per day, enough to satisfy about 80% of their domestic needs and more than they actually needed. But as Venezuela's own economic crisis began getting worse, their exports of oil to Cuba declined by nearly 3/4 to only 16,000 barrels of oil per day by 2025. And now, after the US military captured Venezuela's president through a raid in early January, the Trump administration is threatening to sever even this last drip of oil that's coming into the country too, threatening even more oil shortages and blackouts on the island in the near future. Since capturing Venezuela's president, the Trump administration has been clear in their threats that the communist regime in Cuba could well be next. Within hours of the raid that captured Maduro, Trump and his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, himself the son of Cuban exiles, had this to say.
Well, Cuba's an interesting case. Cuba is, not doing very well right now. That system has not been a very good one for Cuba. The people there have suffered for many, many years. And I think Cuba is going to be something we'll end up talking about because Cuba is a failing nation right now, very badly failing nation. And we want to help the people. It's very similar in the sense that we want to help the people in Cuba, but we want to also help the people that were forced out of Cuba and living in this country. Do you want to say something about that, Marco, please?
Well, I just gave you a statement a few minutes ago about, when the president speaks, you should take him seriously. So, suffice it to say, Cuba is a disaster. It's run by incompetent, senile men, and in some cases, not senile, but incompetent nonetheless. It has no economy. It's in total collapse. And by the way, they were, all of the guards that helped protect Maduro, this is well known, their whole spy agency, all that were full of Cubans. They basically, it's amazing. This poor island took over Venezuela in some cases. One of the biggest problems that Venezuelans have is they have to declare independence from Cuba that tried to basically colonize it from a security standpoint. So, yeah, look, if I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned, at least a little bit.
So, Cuba really isn't in a good spot right now. And with an aggressive US government breathing down their neck after the successful Maduro operation in Venezuela, a lot of analysts have started predicting that the communist regime on the island, in power continually for the past 67 years, is now the closest it has ever been to finally collapsing, accomplishing one of the United States' longest-held geopolitical goals for decades. But people have also been predicting the Communist Party's imminent collapse in Cuba for a long, long time now, at least going back to the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. And yet, it's always somehow managed to endure and hang on despite all of these outside people's expectations. The Communist Party's control of Cuba has made it a thorn in the side of America for generations now. The successive president after president since the Eisenhower administration has never been able to solve. The island is essentially one of the final remaining relics of the Cold War that's still left behind in the world today, including its tense relationship with the United States. Cuba is arguably the only true surviving Marxist-Leninist state left over from the Cold War that never collapsed or significantly pivoted its ideology in the same kind of way that other surviving states that claim to be communist today did, like North Korea, which went down the radical path of its own unique Juche nationalist ideology, or China, Vietnam, and Laos, which have all adopted significant economic and free market reforms that have introduced vibrant private businesses that Cuba has still never done and resisted. And all of this is despite the fact that the world's last pure Marxist-Leninist state exists just 90 miles away from the most capitalistic country on Earth, the United States, who has been embargoing all trade with Cuba and sanctioning it for decades. Now, in order for you to understand how Cuba got to what is potentially the brink of collapse today, why the relationship between Cuba and the United States has remained so tense, even this long after the end of the Cold War, and how the orthodox communist regime in Cuba has somehow managed to survive against all of the odds into the present day and defied everybody's previous predictions of collapse, and why this time might actually finally be different, it helps to begin with just a little bit of backstory. Immediately before the Communist Revolution took place in Cuba, the country was ruled by this authoritarian dictator known as Fulgencio Batista, who was genuinely widely unpopular and also backed by the United States because he did America's bidding, often to the detriment of his own people. Batista was a colonel in the Cuban armed forces who served as the president of Cuba once between 1940 and 1944, and then ran again for a second term in 1952. When he faced almost certain defeat in that second election, he launched a military coup and seized power through force instead, after which he almost immediately suspended the Cuban constitution and revoked most of the country's civil liberties, including the right for anyone to strike. Then, in order to shore up his shaky and illegitimate position, Batista aligned himself closely to the US government as a foreign benefactor, along with Cuba's own wealthy land-owning elites who owned the island's largest sugar plantations, which was Cuba's #1 trading commodity for centuries. Batista was also very closely connected to the American mafia, and in exchange for bribes, he basically gave tax-exempt status to mafia-owned casinos, racetracks, brothels, and nightclubs across the country, which was an open secret across Cuban society throughout the later 1950s. Eventually, due to him basically opening up the entire country to the Americans and other foreigners in exchange for blatant personal bribes, it reached a point under his rule where about 70% of all the arable land in the country was owned by foreigners, including most of the island's most valuable asset, its sugar plantations. And perhaps the most infamous example of Batista's personal corruption and openness to bribes while he was dictator, an American telephone conglomerate literally presented him with a golden telephone during a ceremony to thank him for raising the prices of telephone usage within Cuba to ridiculous levels. Batista was openly willing to be personally bribed and enriched in exchange for making his fellow Cubans have to pay more for basic services provided by American companies, enduring him with absolutely zero loyalty from his own people and consistently making him appear to be nothing but a corporate American-backed stooge to most. As his unpopularity grew within Cuba, Batista consistently and increasingly resorted to the military, censorship, and repression to keep the Cuban people's anger under control, even establishing his own secret police force that conducted massive violence, torture, and even public executions. Throughout Batista's dictatorial rule, it's believed that up to 20,000 Cubans were killed, while countless others were jailed or tortured. And throughout all of this, the US government appeared indifferent to the suffering of the Cuban people, so long as they got what they wanted out of Cuba economically. Throughout Batista's rule in Cuba, there was a saying that the US ambassador was the second most powerful man on the island. He effectively controlled the flow of arms to Batista's regime, which he needed in order to repress his own people and defend his position of power. In exchange for increasing the US arms deliveries, the ambassador would demand more generous conditions for US businesses on the island. Batista, along with his backers in Washington, were so repressive and unpopular in Cuba that large segments of the population began turning to the radical revolution being led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and their guerrillas as a solution to their plight instead. On the final day of the year in 1958, Castro's revolution was finally successful and Batista fled the country on New Year's Day of 1959 for the Dominican Republic, which at the time was ruled by fellow US-backed right-wing dictator Rafael Trujillo. Along with him, Batista also pillaged most of the Cuban treasury's assets to the tune of as much as $700 million worth of cash and fine art, which immediately kneecapped Castro's incoming revolutionary government that overthrew him. Nonetheless, Castro was dramatically popular with most of the Cuban people at the time, both for having overthrown the oppressive and hated Batista regime and for his own personal charisma and sense of presence. Many of Cuba's old elites who were close to the Batista regime immediately began fleeing the country, especially to South Florida, while Castro himself initially insisted that his revolution was not actually communist in nature, attempting instead to present at least a nominal restoration of democracy in Cuba. Nonetheless, the US government was still intensely worried about what Castro's rise to power in Cuba meant for their lucrative and exploitative business interests on the island. So the Eisenhower administration began preparing the top-secret Bay of Pigs invasion operation to use CIA-trained Cuban exile anti-Castro paramilitaries to invade the island and topple Castro. Ideally, from Washington's perspective, enabling them to claim at least some degree of plausible deniability. A few months after the Bay of Pigs plan began being set into motion, American-owned oil refineries on Cuba refused to accept Castro's demand that they begin processing oil from the Soviet Union, which led to Castro nationalizing and expropriating their assets over the summer of 1960, which led to the US halting their imports of Cuba's sugar, which led to Castro retaliating by nationalizing even more US-owned assets in the country in a spiraling tit-for-tat trade war. After JFK assumed the presidency in early 1961, he inherited the Eisenhower administration's planning for the Bay of Pigs operation, which he decided to ultimately authorize in April of that year, a few months later, and which would quickly prove to be a catastrophic overplaying of Washington's own hand. The day before the roughly 1,000-man strong force of Cuban exile paramilitaries hit the beach in Cuba, the US Air Force began bombing strategic Cuban airfields in order to weaken their defenses, and Castro finally publicly declared himself a Marxist-Leninist for the first time in response. The next day, the Cuban exile paramilitaries stormed the beaches at the Bay of Pigs. But in order for the whole plan to work, it required the aerial support of the US Air Force, which never ended up materializing after it almost immediately began going very badly for them, undermining Washington's own goal of maintaining plausible deniability. The entire invasion force was either killed or captured, and the hundreds who were taken prisoner were taken to a sports stadium in Havana where they were publicly and flamboyantly interrogated and harangued by Castro himself on live television, all of which simply ended up skyrocketing Castro's popularity in Cuba as a symbol of resistance against American imperialism. All the Bay of Pigs invasion ended up doing was to rapidly speed up Cuba's transformation into a Marxist-Leninist one-party state, and push it directly into the lap of the Soviet Union. Because almost immediately after it, Castro had both the legitimacy and the power to declare the country a socialist state that would no longer hold any open elections. And this, right here, is part of how the Communist Party of Cuba has managed to hang on to power in Cuba for decades longer than nearly every other communist regime was capable of. In countries across Eastern Europe, like East Germany or Poland or Romania, their communist governments were forced upon them by an outside invader, the Soviet Union. By contrast, Cuba's communist revolution was the result of an entirely natural, domestic, homegrown popular revolution that almost immediately gained strong legitimacy after the US government instantly and clumsily began attacking it in order to maintain their privileged and exploitative business interests on the island. Of course, forever since then, relations between Cuba and the United States have remained extremely negative and tense. The US government severed its relations with Cuba the same year as the Bay of Pigs incident in 1961. And then in the following year, the US declared a full and comprehensive trade embargo against Cuba that has blocked virtually all imports and exports between the two nations ever since, with the sole exceptions being on food, medicine, and humanitarian goods. Running continually for the past 64 years now, even for decades after the Cold War ended, it has evolved into the longest-running trade embargo of modern history, and has contributed greatly to the crushing of the Cuban economy. Since the Cold War ended and starting in 1992, the UN General Assembly has voted no less than 33 consecutive times every single year to adopt a resolution calling for the US to finally end its embargo on Cuba. The US, naturally, has simply voted against the resolution every single time, though. During the most recent vote in October of 2025, 165 of the UN member states voted in favor of the resolution, while the US, along with key allies like Israel, Ukraine, Argentina, Hungary, Paraguay, and North Macedonia, were the only ones to vote against it. The Cuban government and the UN have officially estimated that over its entire length of more than 6 decades now, the embargo has inflicted between $130 and $148 billion US in cumulative damage to the island's economy, and it has continually been used as a tool by the US government to try and pressure regime change. In 1963, following all of the drama associated with the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US government also froze all of Cuba's assets in the United States, and outlawed virtually all financial transactions between the two countries as well. Being completely blocked off from the US and its global alliance system, Cuba needed an outside patron in order to survive. And for decades until the end of the Cold War, that outside patron was the Soviet Union, who provided cheap, subsidized oil to Cuba that they could use for fuel and electricity, while Cuba provided the Soviet Union with cheap sugar and a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere to project power from only 90 miles away from the US mainland. Castro's Marxist-Leninist regime in Cuba, while authoritarian and undemocratic, was also capable of accomplishing some great things on the island. They were able to rapidly improve the literacy rate in Cuba from only about 68% when they took over to 96% within only a couple of years. They also implemented a state-run universal healthcare system free to all Cuban residents, with well-trained doctors and the highest number of doctors per capita in the entire world, which eventually evolved into an influence engine of the Castros of their own, as they could export their well-trained doctors and medical brigades abroad in exchange for resources they needed like oil, food, and medicine back home that they couldn't get from the United States. At the same time, however, that doesn't mean that there weren't also a lot of people in Cuba who were pissed off at the new system of government. Castro seized and nationalized tens of thousands of small private businesses across the country, effectively outlawed all private businesses and enterprises, and redistributed the large agricultural lands and estates that were owned by the prior wealthy elites and foreigners. Unlike other communist leaders in places like East Germany and North Korea that strictly didn't allow any other citizens to leave, Fidel, from time to time, actually allowed waves of disgruntled Cubans who were angry with his way of governance to leave the island as a sort of blow-off valve to relieve pressure and reduce the internal resistance to his government, filtering out the island's demographics to being mostly loyalists who still remained. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution's success in 1959, an estimated 250,000 Cubans, most of them disgruntled former business owners and landowners who were associated with the former Batista regime, left the island within a few years by 1962, most of them across the Florida Strait to Miami and the South Florida region more broadly. Then, between 1965 and 1973, the US government organized the so-called Freedom Flights between Cuba and Miami, a program that was funded by the United States and authorized by Castro that flew hundreds of chartered flights full of additional Cubans who wanted to migrate to the United States. Over the years that the Freedom Flights ran for, an estimated 300,000 additional Cubans were flown out of the country and into Miami and South Florida, who were all granted expedited pathways to US citizenship after they lived in the country for just a single year. All of this mass migration of Cuban exiles who were disaffected with the communist regime on the island into South Florida permanently altered the region's demographic trajectory to this day. And it's why there can sort of be an argument that there are, in reality, two different Cubas today. The Cuba on the island of Cuba and the new Cuba in South Florida. And there have been many, many additional waves of Cuban migration to South Florida since the 1960s and 70s as well. In 1980, following a downturn in the Cuban economy, thousands of Cubans attempted to gain asylum status by taking refuge on the grounds of the Peruvian embassy in Havana, which led to Fidel announcing that anyone who wanted to leave the country could do so freely. The Cuban-American community in South Florida then assembled a hastily put-together flotilla and began ferrying thousands of Cubans to America from the island's Mariel Harbor, which gave this particular exodus its name, the Mariel Boat Lift. Fidel is also known to have opened up his prisons and mental institutions during this specific exodus and sent thousands of prisoners and patients he didn't want along with the rest, who were all taken into South Florida by the boat lift along with thousands of others who wanted to leave for economic or political reasons. Within a few months, another 125,000 more Cubans were transported to the Miami area before the US and Cuban governments mutually agreed to put a stop to it. All of this history of Cuban migration into South Florida has since made it the most Cuban area in the world anywhere outside of the island of Cuba itself. Today, roughly 2 million people in the Miami metropolitan area are of Cuban ancestry. They're the largest single ethnic group present in the Miami area now, and they make up about a third of Miami's total population. When you consider that Havana itself has an estimated metropolitan population of around 2.15 million people now, the Cuban population in Miami is actually about the same size. And since Miami's Cuban population is growing faster than Havana's is, it's conceivable soon that Miami will actually become the largest Cuban city in the world. When you further consider this more recent population exodus from Cuba that's been happening since 2020, South Florida as a broad region now has about a quarter of the same Cuban population as the island of Cuba itself has. Which is why I said earlier that South Florida has basically become a second Cuba. And it's through this lens that I would argue that the Cubans are one of the world's peoples that were also divided along ideological and political lines during the Cold War, like the Germans, Koreans, and Vietnamese all were as well. And just like those other peoples, the Cubans became divided between a hyper-communist system on the island of Cuba and a hyper-capitalist system in their enclave in South Florida. One of Miami's nicknames today is the capital of Latin America, and there's a lot of good points of evidence to back that claim up. Because of the large Cuban population in Miami and other Latino groups, around 70% of the city's population speaks Spanish as their primary language, which makes Miami the only one of America's top 10 largest metropolitan areas that is both majority Spanish-speaking and ethnically Latino. Miami also has, by far, the largest GDP and economy of any majority Spanish-speaking city in the world today, giving it the legitimate authority to claim the title as the Spanish-speaking world's most economically valuable city. Miami, all on its own, currently has more than double the GDP of the entire island of Cuba combined, and it's arguably becoming the most capitalistic city not just in Latin America, but even in the United States. Since 2020, the Miami area has gained another nickname, Wall Street South, because of all of the New York City-based financial companies and institutions that have relocated or shifted their operations there due to the lower taxes and more business-friendly environment. It's been estimated that more than $1 trillion worth of assets have been shifted from New York City to Miami just since 2020, including the headquarter relocations of more than 50 major investment firms. And a big part of why that's been happening is the foundation of Miami as a bastion of exiles from Cuba, who happen to be the most capitalistic-minded Cubans who left the communist system on the island over generations and made Miami, basically, the capitalist alternative to the island of Cuba in the same way that West Germany was to East Germany, or South Korea still is to North Korea. When the Soviet Union suddenly collapsed in 1991, the communist regime in Cuba lost their historical benefactor and supporter and entered into what the government has called the special period throughout the 1990s. In a flash, Cuba lost all of their Soviet-era subsidies and privileged oil imports that had been propping up the economy for decades, which led to their imports and exports crashing by more than 80% and their economy losing about a third of its value over just a couple of years by 1993. Then, as now, there was a lot of speculation that this was inevitably going to become the end of communism on the island. In 1994, in the midst of this crisis, over a period of 5 weeks during particularly intense rioting in Cuba, Fidel once again announced that anybody who wanted to leave the country could do so freely without hindrance, which triggered another mass exodus of around 35,000 Cubans who assembled makeshift rafts and attempted to float over the Florida Strait to America. This exodus ultimately became a sort of turning point in America's relationship with Cuban exiles and refugees. Struggling to deal with the political consequences of this particular exodus, the Clinton administration reformed America's migration policy regarding Cuba through the new wet feet, dry feet policy, which set it so that Cubans caught in the waters by the Coast Guard between the two countries would be summarily returned back to Cuba or sent to a third country, while Cubans who made it to the shore on land in the US would receive a chance to stay in the US and pursue permanent residency and citizenship following a year's time. Conflict between the Cuban and US governments reached a new high point throughout the 1990s as well, where the Cold War effectively never ended like it did in most other parts of the world. In 1996, an organization made up of Cuban-American exiles in South Florida called Brothers to the Rescue were using small private Cessna aircraft to take flights over Cuba to drop anti-Castro propaganda leaflets across the island. In February of that year, a Cuban Air Force MiG-29 fighter aircraft shot down 2 unarmed Cessnas that were taking part in one of these operations, killing all 4 of the Cuban-American exile participants who were on board, and sharply spiking tensions in the process. Then the next year, in 1997, an anti-communist militia of Cuban-American exiles based in South Florida organized a series of bombing attacks against various hotels in Havana in an attempt to undermine Cuba's resurgent tourism industry. 1 foreign tourist from Italy was killed in the bombings, and 11 others were wounded. A man named Luis Posada Carriles later admitted to having organized the bombings, a Cuban-American exile and former CIA officer. Posada had also previously helped organize the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and was widely considered to have been responsible for the bombing of a Cuban commercial airliner back in 1976 that had killed 73 people on board. And he was later briefly jailed in Panama in 2000 for allegedly plotting an assassination attempt on Castro. In 2005, Posada entered the US under a false passport and was granted political asylum status, which further strained tensions as the Cuban government consistently requested his extradition to stand trial in Cuba, which the US consistently rejected until Posada died peacefully in old age at 90 years old in 2018. And then, in 1998, 5 Cuban intelligence officers were arrested by American authorities in Miami on charges of espionage, who later became known as the Cuban Five. After consistently denying that the captured men were intelligence agents, the Cuban government finally acknowledged them 3 years later in 2001, claiming that they were only spying on the Cuban-American exile community in South Florida rather than on the US government itself. Most of the men would be held in prison for the next decade and a half, until the Obama administration later negotiated a prisoner exchange for them with the Cuban government. And all the while, the US trade embargo on Cuba continued, as Cuba floundered around trying to find new trade partners to replace the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc with. Near the end of the decade in 1998, the communist regime in Cuba finally gained a new lifeline after Hugo Chavez and his Socialist Party won the presidential election in Venezuela. Quickly stepping up to largely fill in the gap that was left behind by the Soviets, Chavez's administration in Venezuela began supplying Cuba with a new source of heavily subsidized oil again, in exchange for thousands of doctors with Cuba's well-trained medical brigades, along with their intelligence and security services, both to help spy on their own people and to guard their leadership. At the peak of this cooperation between the two countries between 2008 and 2015, Venezuela was supplying Cuba with approximately 100,000 barrels of subsidized oil per day that met more than half of Cuba's oil import needs and underpinned Cuba's faltering electricity generation and industrial output, while nearly 30,000 well-trained Cuban doctors and medical technicians served in Venezuela. Cuba also gained the capability to resell the subsidized oil that they were receiving from Venezuela to China for higher prices than what they had paid for it, which gave them a rare avenue to acquire hard foreign currency in defiance of the US financial and trade sanctions that were still placed upon them. And meanwhile, tensions between Cuba and the United States remained locked in the old Cold War mentality throughout the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations. Until, for a brief moment, things looked like they might finally begin changing after decades during the later years of the Obama administration. In December of 2014, Obama and Communist Cuba's second president, Raul Castro, Fidel's younger brother who had taken over in 2006 after Fidel grew ill, shocked the world with a dual announcement on television that Cuba and the United States would be fully restoring diplomatic ties again for the first time since the 1960s. While all of his predecessors had demanded immediate political and economic concessions from the Communist Party of Cuba in exchange for a normalization of ties, which were always refused, Obama was the first US president who calculated instead that immediately establishing closer economic, cultural, and political ties with Cuba, even without any upfront concessions from the Communist Party, would gradually result in a moderation of the Communist Party's platform over the long haul anyway. Almost immediately after their joint address, both countries reopened their embassies for the first time in 53 years. A few months later, in 2015, Obama removed Cuba from America's state sponsors of terrorism list. And in 2016, he loosened up US restrictions on Americans' ability to travel to Cuba, enabling US airlines to resume regular air service to the island and for US cruise ships to port in Cuban harbors, which all opened up a massive surge in US tourism to Cuba again, and a big new source of foreign currency for both the government and small local entrepreneurs like taxi drivers and restaurateurs who began catering to them. In just a single year in 2015, because of all of this, Cuba's economy grew by more than 4%. And it was a boon for US businesses as well. For a couple of years, Cuba was one of Airbnb's fastest growing markets, while executives from Marriott and PayPal accompanied Obama's personal visit to Cuba in March of 2016, when he became the first sitting US president to visit the island in 88 years. Obama's opening up to Cuba was massively popular with both Cubans and the broader American public. But as it would turn out, this new policy would only end up lasting for a couple of years, because the successor to the US presidency, Donald Trump, would effectively end and reverse everything. For Trump, railing against Obama's friendly policies towards Cuba and promising to reverse them was a campaign tactic to appeal to conservative Cuban-American voters in South Florida, a demographic long opposed to the continuation of communist rule in their ancestral homeland, both for ideological reasons and also because much of their or their ancestors' property had been expropriated and seized following the revolution that they wanted to be fairly compensated for. Many high-profile Cuban-American politicians, like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, were staunchly opposed to the Obama administration's policies of openness with the regime in Cuba without demanding any major political concessions from them. And Trump's strategy of attempting to appeal to their demographic in the 2016 election ultimately proved to be highly successful for him, as 54% of the Cuban-American voters in Florida chose him, compared to only 41% who voted for Hillary Clinton. This ended up proving to be politically decisive for Trump in Florida, and likely handed him the entire nationwide election. Florida just barely voted more for Trump than Hillary in 2016, with 49% of the state's overall vote to Trump and 47.8%